Shall we begin? Great. Well, welcome. This is a BioSci Careers video on preparing research statements for faculty applications with a focus on R1 institutions. When I was asked to do this, I thought about what context to give it, and many people will be applying to faculty positions at predominantly undergraduate institutions and other types of institutions, but I felt probably most of you are focused more on R1 type institutions. So that's going to be what we'll talk about today. I should warn you that this is dense, all right? This is not going to be light and fluffy, superficial. This is going to be meat, lots of meat. So hopefully you'll be able to follow along. My name is John Boothroyd. I'm a professor in the Department of Microbiology and Immunology in the School of Medicine at Stanford. And the first thing you need to think about is to focus on the substance. So it's pretty hard to write a research application about research that's not very interesting. You can dress it up, but people will see right through it. So what you have to have is research that's really compelling. And that requires thinking, requires doing good work and really thinking, and thinking outside the box. So this is a puzzle many of you will be familiar with. I recently tried it on my grandchildren, and they were amused at the solution. But it's a good example of thinking outside the box. So as you're doing this, you want to be making sure that you differentiate yourself from others in your field, and especially from your advisor. Many of us end up working on a project that we inherit initially, and that's fine. That's a good way to get started. But it's important to prove that you can think originally. And the best way to do that is to make sure that you come up with a project that somebody will say, oh, that's interesting. That person is doing something that's really very different from that lab. You want to communicate your work. So going to meetings and communicating that work at meetings is extremely important. That's a way to get your work known, and it's a way for people to realize that you're doing innovative and interesting stuff. And trying to land some funding is a great way to demonstrate that in a peer review process, some group of experts in your field, presumably, have decided that that's work that's really important and interesting. So that's validating when a search committee is looking at it and say, okay, well, this got funding from Foundation X. That must mean that a group of experts feel like this is innovative work. So those are all things to be thinking about in terms of making sure that what you're actually going to write is worth writing about and is going to be compelling. So the next thing you have to do is reflect, check, and articulate. So what are you doing that for? You have to be sure that the plan has the potential to produce a program that grows over time. So a nice big live oak from up in the hills above us here. And that's what your program's going to be doing. It's got to last for hundreds of years and produce this amazingly full tree. Think about what about your work is really interesting and cool to someone in your field. So we all can easily geek out on stuff that we work on. And that's one of the joys of being a researcher, is that you become so absorbed that it's just so interesting to you. Well, you have to be able to convince other people that it's interesting and that it's expressed in a way where somebody in your field, and even better, somebody not in your field would say, huh, that's cool. That's really cool. That's an interesting question. I never thought about that before. And it's inherently interesting rather than just the people who work on this work yourselves. A second criterion is that it has to be important. Now that's very different from interesting. So there's lots of research that we do that you can maybe convince somebody that it's interesting, but when you are trying to describe it to family members, for example, who are not researchers, who are not scientists, or are not people who are academics, you've got to be able to convince them that that actually is work that is important. And a good test of it is, would you like your taxpayer dollars to be funding work? That's often the source of the funds that are coming here. Next, you want to run this by some friends and colleagues. So articulating that is actually harder than it sounds. If you listen to a Mozart symphony or you see a great painting, you might say, I liked that. Why'd you like it? It just sounded nice. Well, that's not much of an answer. You have to be able to play it out, to elaborate it out in a way that is compelling to an audience, and being able to explain what it is that makes it so interesting and cool, and what is it that makes it so important. And that's something you can practice. All right, some style issues. You want to make it flow. This is just some beautiful leaching minerals in great sandstone in Utah, in southern Utah. So make sure that what you're going to write flows, because this is a document that people will read, and they'll read it as one of potentially 100 or more that they'll be reading, and the easier it is to read, the happier they're going to be, and that's important for you. You can put a little you into it. This shouldn't be a sterile, super formal document that you're writing it for a machine or it's being written by a machine. It's not like writing a publication, which is very formal, and there's very strict rules about it. There's no opportunity to put in sort of emotional statements in there. This is not a formal publication. This is a statement by you, and it's very personal. So you can say things like, I would encourage you even to say things like, I was extremely excited to see whatever. Conveying that is a great way of doing it, and it makes it more personal, much more readable, and also much more compelling. You want to bold some things strategically. I'm a big fan of using bold rather than underlining or italics. You should use only one, whichever one you use. Don't use underlining sometimes, italics sometimes, bold other. It becomes very confusing. Bold is the one that I think really jumps out at the person. And when you read bold, especially if you're like me, when I read, I'm hearing. I actually sort of like almost literally hear the words in my head. When I read bold, I hear them very loudly. So that's something that's really emphasized when I see bold. Okay? You want to reflect your command of what you're talking about. And the way you do that is by having some white space in there, some lines between sections, the borders that don't go right up to the very edge of the page. And what that says to me when I see that there's some space there is, this person is under control. They know what they're talking about. They're not panicked. They're not stressed. They're not trying to make the point 10 times over because they're not really secure about it. No, they've got it. They're just totally confident. So that's a trick that you can use. Spell checking and proofreading. The worst nightmare of any academic institution is having a faculty member who goes kind of off the rails and whose work ends up being retracted and becoming part of a national scandal. That's more or less their worst nightmare. If you don't proofread and spell check, they're going to be worried you're not going to pay attention to detail, and through no sort of fault of yours in terms, or at least no active intent to falsify or fabricate, but you're sloppy. That's not any institution wants to be associated with. So you can send a very strong signal by, in the negative sense, if you don't spell check and proofread, and this is an application for the rest of your job for the rest of your life, and you're not paying attention now, you're not going to pay attention when the research starts rolling in. All right, so here's the things they're going to be thinking about. They're going to be asking themselves as they read this. First of all, would I want to be stuck on an island, an itty-bitty tiny island at that, and hearing about this for the rest of my life? The reality is, in a faculty position, it is very possible that you will be literally a colleague with that person for the rest of your life. You'll be listening to their trainees. You'll be listening to them talk. That's a very exciting thing if it's somebody whose work is interesting, and it's a really horrible thought if it's somebody whose work isn't interesting to you. So think about that. I've been here over 36 years. Some of my colleagues have been stuck listening to my stuff and my students and my postdocs for 36 years. It's a long time. Second, they'll be thinking, can they deliver? Can this person actually, so I'm reading this interesting research, but can they actually deliver on the sort of the hyperbole and what they're saying they'll be able to do, but will they actually be able to do it? And third, is their work pregnant with possibility. And I just like this phrase, and I'll give you a graphical image there to try and burn it into your retinas. But what that means is that somebody who's poised, they've got this really wonderful body of research that they've completed probably as a postdoc, and it's just ready to blossom. Okay? And that, if that's the situation that somebody presents themselves with to a committee, that's what they love, because they think, wow, this is just going to explode in a fantastic way. So that pregnant with possibility is a really key thing. If the answer to all three of those questions is yes, somebody I'd like to listen to forever, somebody who can deliver, and somebody who's got something that's just ready to really launch into the world, then you get the job. That's all you got to do. All right, so how are we going to convince them all this? You're going to start drafting your research statement. You want it to hang together. So I choose pictures that maybe convey that or not, but you can decide. It needs to be a document that really feels like it's connected from the beginning to the end. It all flows all the way through. 3 pages is probably the maximum you want to be aiming for, single-spaced, with an appropriate sized font. There are no rules about this, unlike a lot of funding agencies that will say, but it's probably a good guideline to use those agency funding rules, and something like an 11-point Arial font I think is a good one. Within those 3 pages, it's a good idea to have a summary. Anytime you write something for a busy audience and people who are likely just skimming, and the search committee may be skimming through these applications to see which are the ones that are worth bringing to the group as a whole. So that's often there's a triage process. They'll be just looking, see approximately what's there. If you don't have a summary, and the real meat of what you're doing isn't really found until page 2 or even page 3, they're not going to read that far. They're going to stop reading. So you want to give them a summary that has your big pitch. It's your elevator pitch that gets them hooked into reading more. The remainder of the sections, we'll talk about each of these very briefly, are the background, the current work, the future plans, and then a conclusion. So we're starting, the summary is essentially a conclusion. We're ending with a conclusion. And those are ways of bookending what you write and really making your message very strong. So what are some things to remember as you're doing it? Putting in some pretty figures is great. They should be intuitive. They should be clear. You should be talking about them. So if it's a model, especially, for example, as I'm showing you there, you can refer to that. That accomplishes 2 things. One is it clarifies the material you're trying to present, and it also it gives you an opportunity to talk about it in detail, and best of all, it breaks up the page. So instead of seeing this page that's just all words, I love when I flip it open and I see that there's pictures in there. It just breaks the monotony of it, makes it feel lighter. I don't have to read so much, and it's kind of a win-win. You want to tailor what you're going to write. Now, the basic message will be constant. So what you're planning to do will likely be the same regardless of where it is that you're planning to go. But the reality is that in a given institution, how that plays out over time will depend on their colleagues that you have. These are people with whom you will collaborate. So you want to recognize that rule numbers 1, 2, and 3 of all communication are know your audience, know your audience, know your audience. Think about who's reading this and what will resonate with them. So you might give it a different spin, a different emphasis. If it was a biochemistry department, I could end up in a biochemistry department, a genetics department, a microbiology department, an immunology department. What I would write for all 4 of those departments would be really quite different, even though the essence of it was all the same, ultimately. But the spin I put on it would be different. So you really want to make sure you tailor that. You want to cite strategically. So this is not a grant application. It's not a publication where you're going to have 100 references or something. But put some of the key ones in there. Just put them at the end. You don't have to give the full title on things. But it's both good professional practice, plus also you never know. Somebody reading it might be somebody in your field, and they might be pretty offended if you don't cite them. So be careful about that and professional. All right, so the summary is your hook. what are you going to do? You're going to start with the big picture. Right? And you're going to give this context of what you're trying to do. And then you're going to dive into what makes it interesting and what makes it important. I'm going to give you an example in a minute here of this. Then you're going to spend 1 or 2 sentences talking about what's your approach, what are your findings that you have so far, and then what are your future plans. This is really, it's at most, for sure no more than half a page, but I'd say you want to be aiming for 1/3 of a page. And then you end that summary with a statement that takes it back to the big picture. So it embraces it. And here's an example. So I'm going to read this to you. Intracellular parasites in the phylum Apicomplexa are responsible for many serious human diseases such as malaria, cryptosporidiosis, and toxoplasmosis. What am I going for there? You got the choice between important and interesting. I'm going to go with important. Right? So it's not interesting that these cause disease, but it's important to be getting that out. The next sentence is, one of the most remarkable features of these single-celled eukaryotes is their ability to infect another eukaryotic cell. All right, now I'm trying to get into interesting. And it is quite remarkable that one of these cells can invade into another cell. That seems to me inherently an interesting thing. Now in bold, I write, toxoplasma is exceptional in that it can infect almost any animal cell it encounters by injecting its own receptor into the host cell and then using that as an anchor to pull itself in. Bold, pay attention, because that's a key sentence when I bold it, right? The goal of my research is to understand at the molecular level how this is achieved. So it's a really strong statement of what it is I want to know, and I'm being explicit about that's what I want to know. To accomplish this, I've used a combination, so this is now the approach, right, of genetics, biochemistry, and structural biology, leveraging strategic collaborations. What am I doing there? I'm saying I'm a team player. I'm a colleague. I'm not going to be a lone wolf sitting in my group. You know, nobody in my group talks to anybody in anybody else's group. We lock the door. Absolutely the opposite. I like collaboration. So leveraging strategic collaborations that I've found to be both extremely enjoyable and highly productive. Signaling there, you're going to be stuck with me for the rest of your life on this tiny little island, but it won't be the hell it could otherwise be because I actually like playing with other people. This has revealed the identities of many of the key molecules involved. All right, so that's now giving the approach and my preliminary results. Not a ton of detail. In bold, for the future, because this is an application for the future, I will dissect the precise mechanisms used by these molecules as they collaborate to drive toxoplasma into a cell. That's the statement of what you're going to get when you hire me. I hope to continue to benefit from a collaborative mindset, building a detailed understanding of the unique molecular machine these proteins represent, trying to make it interesting, unique, remarkable. Those are words that you might not write in a formal publication, but you can in this context. Ultimately, so now we're into the future, I will expand my work into the study of the related human parasite, Plasmodium species, the cause of human malaria, which shares much of the same machinery, but which has adapted to invade a single cell type in a single host species. Okay, so that's trying to expand the importance of the work. And then the capping sentences, this work will, I believe, provide new mechanistic insight into a remarkable biological process in a class of important human pathogens. All right, so that's a summary. They read that, and hopefully you've hooked them. And they're going to say, this is relevant. And if it's not relevant, then you're moving on, they're moving on, nobody's wasting each other's time. But that's the hope. All right, so that's the summary. The remainder, your other 2 2/3 pages, what are you going to put in there? The background. So this will be maybe a half page. And you want to lead with the most interesting and important aspects of the area that you're studying. All right, so put that in there and really play it up. Put a little eye candy in there. It's nice to see, as I said, models are nice to see. Any results that are in the field that frame the question rather than words. A picture is worth 1,000 words is cliched, but it really is true. Talk about how you ended up working on this. So it's nice to put in your story in the background. So when I was a graduate student, I was working on X and I became very interested in Y. And you're going to try and create an arc, a story arc that takes you from your graduate work through your postdoctoral work and into then your faculty work. So they feel like there's a plan there. And you may have to be a little contriving about that, but there probably is, right? Something that there always is a way of connecting these parts, so you want to do that. And the idea is they would feel like you've been grooming yourself for this day, that you have this great master plan. You don't want to be artificial about it, but the truth, I'm sure, lies in there. You want to identify the questions that are unanswered. So as you're presenting the background, to frame it and say, so we know this and we know this, but we don't know this. And that's probably going to be bolded. That's going to jump out at them. Here's what we don't know. That bolding should be strategic. I've seen ones where it's 2 sentences that aren't bolded. That's a little overwhelming. So be really strategic about it and think, what are the things I want them to hear as if I'm shouting? All right, the next section is going to be the research that's been accomplished to date. Again, you're going to want some images in there. This may be up to a page out of your 3 pages. You want to include some key results. They should be really crisp. They should send a strong signal of rigor. Rigor is crucial for the reasons I said before. You don't want somebody worrying that they're going to hire somebody who 5 years from now is going to be on the front page of Nature or the gossip pages of Nature because they got fired, because whatever. So you're going to be super rigorous. Make sure you do cite others, as I said, in terms of that overall thing. And then be explicit about the unanswered questions your research reveals. So this is framing it up. What have we found? What do we need to figure out in the future? And then that's a great segue into the future. So my future plans are to answer these questions, to address these questions. Now, this is the rest of it. So we've left with about 1.5 pages. Flowcharts are great. So if you can present something that says, here's the overall plan. This may not be a great example. This is from a grant I wrote with colleagues here. You don't want to fall into the trap of thinking, I'm going to write this like a grant with tons of detail. This is more a vision statement rather than, here's exactly what I will do. So the detail, the space you've got isn't there. And also, a grant isn't visionary. A grant tends to be, in the words of a former colleague, especially if you're applying to the NIH, perfect mediocrity. The best grant is perfect mediocrity. There's no flaws in it. It's going to work because it's so boring and it's so predictable that it just has to work. That's not what anybody wants to hire you for in terms of a research career and a faculty position. They want vision. So you don't want to get too carried away there, but you definitely want to err on the side of being more visionary than prosaic. Talk about the near term. What are you going to do first? Okay. What's going to be that first big grant? What's it going to be on? And that might be the bulk of what you're going to talk about here. And then you might end with a bit longer term, the second grant. So that's a typical formula, is to give them a sense of, I'm going to launch with this, but I'm really intrigued by this other, and that's where I want to go in the long term. So in that fantasy paragraph that I gave you, that summary that I wrote there, just for this purpose, I talked about how we start with toxoplasma, we're ready to go, we've got all these reagents, but we want to move on to plasmodium at some point because malaria is this major killer. So that's the first and a second project, and they will sequence in a very logical way. You want to talk about your philosophy here. Are you somebody who likes to collaborate? Why is that? What have you benefited from? What kind of a group do you want to run? What's going to be the style of your mentoring? Are you going to be a micromanager? You probably won't self-declare, but there may be cues that that's your inclination. Or are you going to be somebody who's more a facilitator? Somebody who runs their research group like an incubator, a startup incubator, and inspires people and says, come on in, bring your best ideas, I'll help you make them a reality. Okay? So you can signal that explicitly or implicitly in what you write. What's your group composition? Are you looking forward to working with all undergrads, all postdocs, all technicians, all graduate students? What kind of mix and why do you want to have that? That's blending over a little bit to the teaching statement, but it's appropriate to put some mention of it here. You're going to end with a conclusion. This is a chance to make your point emphatically at the very end, because last impressions count as much as first impressions. So give a concluding sentence or two that summarizes it all in a personal way. Here's one that might work if I was writing an application. I am extremely excited. So you'd never write that in a formal publication, right? In a paper, you can't say where you're really excited by these results, but you can for this. At the prospect of launching an independent research program that will reveal a complete mechanistic understanding of the invasion machinery of these important and extremely complex organisms. I hope to have the opportunity of doing that at, fill in the blank, where I believe, and then you make the connection. Right? So you help them see that you're writing this for them in particular, and that you think there's a synergy that's possible here, a complementarity between you and the rest of that institution, and together you can do amazing things. So that's how you want the message you want to end with, because that's key. So the take-home messages from all this are, think and differentiate from others now. So the point of this is my audience is people who are in training. Well, think about what you're going to be writing about and try to make sure that it is work that gets people genuinely excited and allows them to conclude that this is not incremental work that you're doing based on work that other people have done, but rather this is completely new and novel and original thinking. Use a brief summary to hook your audience. Tailor it. So write about some of the people that you might be working with. Now you have to be careful there not to be presumptuous and say, you know, I would expect to collaborate with A, B, and C, because A, B, and C may have no interest in collaborating with you, but you can phrase it in a way that says, you know, I think there's great complementarity between my work and A, B, and C, and I would enjoy interacting with those groups because of that complementarity. Make sure you write for those outside and inside your field. So your application will be read by people who might be world authorities on what you're writing about, and others who have very little idea of the details there. They've never heard of toxoplasma, and you have to accommodate both groups in what you write. And then lastly, make it flow. And don't be too formal. You can inject a little personality into this. It's a statement. It's not a formal publication. I will end there and simply wish you good luck with it. It's actually a fun exercise to do. It's a chance to find your voice. And good luck. I'm sure you will find good things out there. Thank you.